For Marxist analysis of economics typically is either about capitalism in general, in abstract, or it focuses on US capitalism, or perhaps to less often the capitalism of one or another country. But I think that Mandel is one of the only major Marxists to really concentrate on understanding the world economy and do a credit to both of them. I do not know Mandel personally. Anecdotes to share. However, I did come to know him as a scholar once I myself became interested in Marxism. It was not long before although I may have read a few of his shorter articles here and there, my major introduction to Ernest Mandel was actually in reading something that very few of us have recalled here so far today, which is his introductions to the 3 volumes of Capital when they were published by New Left Books in a new translation in English. Those introductions, I would wager, are really works of interpretation in their own right, and really fine works they are too. And I think it also shows one of the key characteristics of Mandel's thinking, which is to try and be as close to Marx and Engels' own thinking as possible, of course, without being uncritical. Louis mentioned my book, Geopolitical Economy, after US hegemony, globalization, and empire. And when I was writing it, and the writing of that book took many years, I found reading Mandel very useful. And so I particularly appreciate the opportunity today to concentrate very fully on his work, just focus on what he was talking about and what he meant, and so on. And in particular, what I like to do whenever I look at the thinking of any particular thinker, I like to do certain things. One is put that thinker in historical perspective. I would like, as far as possible, to, in my remarks, to put Mandel in historical perspective, and also put him in the center of the contemporary issues that he was wrestling with. What was he trying to understand? What were the big problems of his time? And so on. What were the debates he ended up engaging with his contemporaries, other Marxists often? And often, as somebody pointed out today, also mainstream scholars, which is not the least reason why he also gained a lot of respect in the mainstream of scholarship, not just among Marxists. And this also reminds me that I always insist that very often as Marxists, we tend to separate Marx and Engels and all other Marxists from the continuity of Western intellectual history. And this is wrong. You cannot, Marx and Engels represent a pinnacle, a high point of Enlightenment thinking. And you cannot understand what came after Marx and Engels unless you take what they did into account, how they fundamentally altered the interpretation of capitalism, of capitalist society, of bourgeois, and throughout, in philosophy, in political economy, in anthropology, you name it, they have made their mark. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand the further evolution of Western thought, you don't understand that major figures, whether it is Max Weber, or Durkheim, or Pareto, or Schumpeter, or whoever it is, they were all animated by they were all impelled, and one of the chief motives was to gainsay what Marx and Engels had said, to somehow to better it from a bourgeois point of view. So even if you are studying bourgeois thought, you cannot escape the influence of Marx and Engels. And I think if I do this, and if I insist on this a great deal these days, I'm sure that I got it in important respects from my early introduction to Mandel's own thinking. And of course, the other thing is I would like to put Mandel in the context of the historical developments that he was himself witness to and felt himself compelled to interpret for other Marxists and for the world as a whole. he always addressed, I think, the world as a whole, not just a sectarian Marxist groupuscle here or there. And when I therefore put in the time to focus on Mandel alone and say, okay, put all the things I'm interested in chronological order, read them, think about why he said what at various points, I'm happy to report that I feel that I can report to you that Mandel is seminally important in continuing the Marxist tradition of the Marxist tradition in general, and in particular, I would say that, and I'm sticking my neck out here because I haven't really sat and thought about, eliminated all other major Marxist figures, but I think I would certainly hypothesize that Mandel is probably the only Marxist thinker of his generation who gives us the tools with which to understand how our contemporary 21st century multipolar world economy emerged. Because we all use the term multipolarity, we talk about it, we say the world is multipolar. Few of us really understand and appreciate the extent to which this requires us to throw out of the window so many ways of thinking that we have become captive of over the last 2 or 3 decades. Let me just read off the 3 that I name in the title of my book. Ideas about US hegemony, ideas about globalization, and ideas about empire, which were, of course, a rejuvenation of ideas about US hegemony. Because all these ways of thinking about the world economy suggest to us that the world economy is a unified whole. That its division into a plurality, into a large number of individual nation states is irrelevant. That in fact national economies don't exist. Only the world economy does. National borders don't matter. Only the world economy exists, etc. All of these, and Mandel lived through the decades during which these ways of thinking were generated and became dominant. But he never accepted them. He contested them. And that is why we can take his intellectual legacy in order to understand where we are at today. And in the course of my lecture today, the way in which I mean this should become fairly clear. So in this sense, I think that he is the true heir of Marx and Engels and their classical successors. These were the people, and by the classical successors, I mean also Lenin, Luxemburg, Hilferding, Bucharin, and in a sort of different compartment, I put John Hobson, the major writer, social democratic writer on imperialism, who Lenin regarded very highly, and whose help he took in composing his own imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Because once again, few of us realize that these writings, which emerged in the early years of the 20th century, were in fact some of the first serious writings on international relations. If you take an international relations course in most Western universities, you will be taught that the discipline of international relations dates from after the First World War, when people, some generic ordinary people, insisted that there should be no longer secret treaties, that nations should have open relations with one another, etc. And that once the relations between nations cease to be the secret affairs of diplomats, then you could study international relations. This is nonsense, because these writings by Lenin, by Luxemburg, by Hilferding, by Bucharin, Hobson, etc., they had already been written. And what's more, they contain another very, very important thing. They took very seriously the injunction that you cannot just talk about international relations without talking about the relations between the capitalist economies that underlies these international relations. You cannot talk about the relations between England and Germany without understanding the underlying economic relationships between those two economies. And remember, at that time, both economies were imperial economies. by definition, they overspill their national borders. So, in this sense, I would say that Mandel continues this tradition, and again, at least as far as I know, he was alone among his generation of Marxists to do so, because a lot of other Marxists, as we heard this morning, they took Lenin's idea, for example, of monopoly capitalism, Baran and Sweezy, but then they converted it into something very unlike Marxism at all. They eradicated any notion of contradiction from it. They eradicated any notion of crisis from it, and so on. And of course, let me leave it at that. So in that sense, I think, so that just as you, and Mandel understood this very well. Most of us know that you cannot understand, if you are a Marxist, you cannot produce a discourse about politics in any country, whether it is Mexico or England or Canada or wherever, without understanding the underlying class relationships. Similarly, you cannot produce a theory of international relations if you're a Marxist, without understanding the underlying relationships between the economies of these countries. And Mandel understood that very, very well. And in fact, in his practical writing, whether he was writing about the US and its relationship with the rest of the world, the relationship between the US and Europe, the impulses behind European integration, the relationship between rich countries and poor countries, in all these respects, he put at the center of his analysis his understanding of the economic relationships between these countries. He did not subscribe to any glib notions of, oh, the world is global, oh, the US is hegemony, etc. So this is, in general, what I want to argue. And so what I want to do first is I just want to say a few things about my main arguments in my book, Geopolitical Economy, because invariably, having just written it, I'm looking at Mandel very much through the lens of this book. But I will be very brief because I'm going to talk about this in more detail in a couple of days. Then I want to say a few things about Mandel generally, and then I want to emphasize three very, very important points that I think are critical for understanding how Mandel understood what Marx calls somewhere at the very end of the Grundrisse. You know, Marx has this wonderful little vignette on the American protectionist economist Henry Carey. It's a neat fragment. And in it, he talks about the relations between producing nations. You have to understand international relations in terms of the relations between producing nations, and that's what Mandel did. So I want to go, and he did so in a way, I would argue, it makes him one of the few people to anticipate the arrival of multipolarity. And he then therefore becomes indispensable, one of the key resources that we have to try and understand how the world became multipolar. And let me end this introductory section just by telling you exactly what I mean by multipolarity. A multipolarity, I mean a situation in the world economy in which not only is there not a single pole, you know, during the Cold War we talked about a bipolar world economy. Then after the Soviet Union collapsed, when we started talking about a unipolar world economy, there was only one pole. The US was triumphant, people started dusting off old theories about, you know, super imperialism and whatever. But actually, less than 2 decades later, what we are now talking about, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we're talking about multipolarity. And this does not just mean that the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, etc., United States, Western Europe, and Eastern Asia are somehow the three major poles of capitalist accumulation of the world. We mean something more than that. What we are witnessing for the first time in a very, very long time, in fact the first time ever, except for one exception which I'll come back to in a second, the emergence of formerly colonized countries as major players in the world economy. Not just catching up with the first world in terms of sheer economic size. Because, you know, I mean, and I should say this is not a mean achievement. I mean, China has 1 billion people. India has nearly 1 billion people. But I remember so clearly when I was growing up, actually reading like I was a teenager, not exactly a child, but certainly, you know, old enough to know what was going on. I remember learning to my dismay that at that time, the total GNP of India was less than that of Belgium. I want you to absorb this. The total GDP of India was less than that of Belgium. So the fact that India, China, yes, they may be populous, but the fact that they're even catching up in sheer economic size is something that we should note. Even this was not anticipated. And what's more, I think that there are signs now, and of course this is not assured. You know, people who say China is growing at 7% this year, so it will continue growing at 7% for many years to come, this is false. But should such growth continue, or should something like such growth continue, it is also the case that the per capita income gap between rich countries and poor countries, which had been widening for so many of the last decades, will at least start closing ever so slowly. And this will be a historic achievement. And when we say multipolarity, we mean all these things. And therefore, it's a very, very important event in the history of the world, in the recent history of the world, especially because, of course, if you go back far enough, then per capita income differences between Europe and Asia or wherever were not very high. It was the Industrial Revolution that started creating these differences. The post-war world order made them even greater, but now we may be just beginning to narrow them. So that's what I mean by multipolarity. In geopolitical economy, I basically make three arguments, and I'll just quickly enumerate them. Number one, I argue that contrary to what both mainstream economists and the bulk of Marxist economics argues, the state plays a very, very important role in managing economies, in managing capitalist economies. And at least two things are important. One is, of course, the inevitable crisis tendencies of capitalist economies must be managed. And of course, the political crisis tendencies arising from the inherently unjust character of capitalism must be managed by giving poor people some concessions here and there. But also, states have played a very, very central role in something else. We all know about imperialism, it's in the title of my talk today, but there is also something else which we don't often talk about. Imperialism is typically a wider phenomena associated with the fact that that world capitalism has developed in an uneven fashion. And what that does is it concentrates capitalist development in lumps. So North America constitutes one lump, Western Europe constitutes another lump, and Japan constitutes a third lump, for example. But then what happens is once capitalism begins to develop in this uneven fashion, other countries which have the capacity to do so start implementing policies which help them industrialize to catch up with the competitiveness. This is what we generally call developmental states, for example. Germany had one, Japan had one, even the United States had one. That is how they resisted the competitive pressures of the UK economy and caught up with it in the late 19th century. So I argue, and so this is what I call the dialectic of uneven and combined development. Uneven development is the character of capitalism, but it calls forth, in response, combined development. And here I insist that although many Marxists think that combined development is something that happens when backward countries undertake socialist revolutions and then industrialize, as classically Russia did, this is not the only type of combined development you see. You also see capitalist combined development of the sort that the Germanys, the Japans, the United States of this world, post-war recovery of these countries, etc. This is also combined development. And what we are now seeing to a large extent in the emerging economies. So, and so what this means is that, and these people who develop in a combined fashion, they always contested what I call the cosmopolitan theories of the world order. Theories of the world order which said that the world economy is a seamless whole. 19th century free trade, and in the 20th century ideas of US hegemony. and globalization and empire. These were all cosmopolitan theories, and their function was to try to forestall combined development. And unfortunately, too many Marxists accepted these ideas. I won't go into too great of a detail there, but in including uneven and combined development in my understanding of world capitalism, what I also say, and I think Mandel would agree, class is not the only material product of capitalism. So is nation. Lenin, Luxembourg, people like that, they would have understood this like that. But it has been many, many decades of effectively stupefying cosmopolitan theories that have prevented us from understanding it as easily. I can talk to you in the question and answer session as to why these theories are so current, but I won't go into that. That's my first argument. Secondly, I argue as a consequence, because you don't just have uneven development, you also have combined development. Because of combined development, the dominance of the first industrializing country in the world, the United Kingdom, was inevitable. It had to happen. But it was also, once it ended, and it was ended by about 1870 by the contender industrialization, by combined development in US, Germany, Japan, etc. Once it ended, it was unrepeatable. And what the period that we call the period of US hegemony is actually a period not of accomplished US hegemony, but a series of attempts on the part of the United States to create something like hegemony. All of them failed, which is why every time one failed, the US tried something else, that failed, it tried something else, etc. We are at the moment living in a time when such single power dominance cannot even be attempted. And finally, I argue that globalization and empire were the ideologies of the last two attempts, based on the stock market bubble and the housing bubble respectively, to try to create such a situation of hegemony that looks like that. So that's briefly about my geopolitical economy. So generally, what I want to say about Mandel is that when you read Mandel, when he makes theoretical statements, which are actually quite few and far between, but when he makes them, he often does end up agreeing with some of these cosmopolitan views. Because, for example, one of those views would be that third world countries cannot develop, because you only have uneven development, you don't have combined development. Okay? And Mandel does say that, and I do quote some in my longer paper, I quote some of these things, but in his concrete analysis, when he's trying to understand concrete situations, he always overcomes them. Also, he continues, to my mind, the tradition of classical political economy that includes Marx and Engels, and that includes their classical successors, and specifically rejects the neoclassical model, which is at the root of our inability to understand that the division of the world into national states and national economies actually does make a big difference. Okay, so let me just then now concentrate in the little time I have left on the three main points that he had. So first of all, I think it's very, very important for us to understand that when Mandel was trying to understand how did nation states and national economies relate to one another, he put the classical understanding of capitalism as a contradictory system at the core of his understanding. And therefore, a lot of the relations between nation states were concerned with trying to cope with the contradictions inherent in national capitalisms. So, for example, when you read, he is very clear that a large part of what's going on in the relations of producing nations is the search for markets. The demand deficit is inherent to capitalism. Again, this is often denied by many Marxist scholars as well as mainstream scholars because they subscribe to some version of Say's law. But Mandel never took that seriously. He said the demand deficit is very real. It forces countries to seek markets elsewhere. And in order to seek markets elsewhere, then they are forced to try various subterfuges, whether it is foreign direct investment or trying to come up with favorable trade deals with each other, etc. So that's one thing. Secondly, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. He took this extremely seriously. He put it at the core of his understanding of world capitalism and also the crisis of world capitalism in the 1970s. And of course that the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is an outcome of competition. The other thing that he also understood is that, of course, Marx was right about something else, the increasing concentration of capital over time. Right? This is itself a result of the mechanisms involved with competition, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and as we already talked about this morning, another very key concept, the unflagging search for surplus profit. Surplus profit is key to understanding it. Mandel says the rise of monopoly capitalism does not erase any of these things. What it does, however, and this is why this is so important for an understanding of the world economy, it internationalizes competition. Many mainstream scholars understand that. They even produce theories that just if they say, for example, British economists say to their governments, you should support national leaders, right? You should support the concentration of capital. You should support increasing monopoly, and then you should support these big monopoly companies when they are competing with their international competitors. Maybe I'll stop for a second to let everybody sit down. reiterate the main point, the first point then, for Mandel, competition lies at the key, and monopoly does not mean that competition is erased, but only that competition is internationalized. Therefore, all these efforts for all this literature, which is, there's piles of literature out there, which is Marxist, which looks at the economy. However, what it does is it looks either at the US economy or this or that national economy. This is not enough. You have to understand the world economy as a single system. So that's the first point. Secondly, Mandel also understood something else which is very, very important. The role of the state. He very, very clearly says that under monopoly conditions, the state plays an ever greater role in the economy. And again, this does not mean that the contradictions of capitalism have been overcome, and he polemicized against a number of social democratic writers who argued precisely this, that we have overcome. He specifically mentions the English social democrat Tony Crosland, who argued this, and many other people. He says no, the contradictions of capitalism are not thereby overcome. Again, they only become internationalized, and the consequences of these contradictions even become ever more massive and more difficult to deal with. So that's the second major point that Mandel understands very well, I think. And finally, the third point, which is actually to me consists itself of three quite different points. But let me state the third point generally in very general terms. Mandel definitely subscribed to the idea that the classical theories of imperialism meant something were very important in trying to understand our contemporary world. Okay, and this is again very different from what a lot of Marxist writers did, because while they constantly pay homage, to the classical theories, they talk about Lenin, a great writer, etc., etc. They also explicitly or implicitly believe. Of course, Hilferding, with the onset of financialization, everybody mentions Hilferding. Very few actually understand what Hilferding wrote in Finance Capital. But nevertheless, let me just say that people talk about, but they quietly assume that all those writings do not mean anything today for one fundamental reason. They reject the idea of intercapitalist competition and intercapitalist rivalry. They simply think this is an old hat. You know, with the United States is the leader of the Western world, the capitalist world. Capitalists no longer war with each other. In fact, some leading writings, some Marxist writings have been praised to the skies, which argue precisely this: capitalist nations will never go to war with one another. So this, by definition, means that those old writings are rejected. Mandel did not think so. He saw himself as the heir of those writers, and he kept the notion of intercapitalist competition at the core of his understanding. So that all of his understanding of world capitalism. And so one thing, for example, he continued to insist on is that Europe, the relationship between Europe and the United States in particular, is a rivalrous one. It is one of rivalry. The very process of European integration, he wonderfully demonstrates how the European integration is driven by the desire of European capital to stand up to American capital. This is why they are doing it. Okay, so this is very, very important. So Mandel argues, for example, that he wrote a very fine little work called Europe versus America, which was published in 1970. And of course, we saw the major thrust behind European integration, as we know, only increased after that time. And he begins this book with the following words: "Never in human history has a country exercised global power comparable to that of the United States at the end of the Second World War. No power ever lost absolute supremacy so quickly. The American century did not last 10 years. Yeah, the American century, 100 years. It's a bit like, I was talking to my class the other day, the undergraduate class. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. Similarly, the American century lasted less than 10 years. So that's one point, and I think Mandel always understood, and I think that without understanding that, we will not understand multipolarity, because, as again we talked about this earlier today, while the US is supposedly hegemonic in the 50s and 60s, where's the real growth taking place? It's taking place in Western Europe. This is the real growth story, and that story is a story of combined development. To try to undo the massive unevenness that the wars created in the world economy. The wars, on the one hand, destroyed productive capacity in Western Europe and Japan. During the course of the war, between 1939 and 1945, the US economy nearly doubled its size. It would not double again for 22 years. Yeah? 6 years versus 22 years. These 22 years were the so-called golden age of growth. Even then, the US economy took 22 years to double its size. So we can see what the war did. And again, Mandel understood this very well. So the combined development of Western Europe and Japan, state-directed, heavily protectionist combined development, was at the root of the growth that took place in the Golden Age. And it very quickly, in the course of this development, US lost its competitiveness. Very, very important, something Mandel understood very well. So that's one. The second sub-point here, the third point, is that the other part on the other situation on which Mandel applied his understanding of uneven and combined development related to third world countries. Now here also, Mandel has, I can quote you lots of points on which Mandel is as impossibilist. I don't know whether you all have this term, but we used, when I was a graduate student and I learned about dependency theory, we were taught that the modernization theorists were inevitabilists. They said that development of industrialization of third world countries was inevitable. And then along came dependency theory to refute that and say that third world industrialization was impossible. So inevitabilism was confronted by impossibilism. And there are many statements in Mandel that read like impossibilism. But again, when he sought to try and understand specific concrete issues, he understood not only that third world industrialization was possible, but he also understood the theoretical reasons why. So, and here I just want to emphasize this, because again, I myself, until I came to write this essay, I myself did not understand exactly why Mandel had such a powerful understanding. And this is because Mandel had found the one point in Marx's writings which I had read, but I sort of had passed over. I had not fully understood the significance of this. In volume 3, in the section of the countervailing factors that may sometimes, partially attenuate the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, Marx talks about foreign trade. And here Marx has a full-fledged critique of Ricardo's idea of comparative advantage. Okay? So here, Marx, Mandel alone among the Marxists of his generation, built his understanding on a purely Marxist conception. And it was based on Marx's demonstration that, contrary to Ricardo, there was no international equalization of the rates of profit, and that the profit differentials enabled the extraction of super profit. Of course, how is this connected with combined development? Policymakers of countries that have policy autonomy see this very clearly. And they engage in state-directed combined development precisely to overcome the disadvantage, precisely to stop being in a situation where foreign capital is extracting surplus profit from your country and start a process of autonomous industrialization based on that. And so, for example, Mandel is very clear, writing in the mid-1970s, when the industrialization in the Third World was a very important issue to be dealt with. He said the initial industrialization of many semi-colonial countries has, of course, completely changed the situation. That is a situation where foreign capital extracts surplus profits in some fields of traditional light industry such as textiles. Precisely because of backward conditions in the semi-colonial countries, above all the much lower level of wages, these countries have become formidable competitors of imperialism in this field. No British or American industrialist or trader can hope to make surplus profits by exporting cotton goods to India or Egypt, or by exporting nylon shirts to Hong Kong. But this very industrialization creates a new and no less impressive productivity differential in favor of imperialist countries in international trade. This takes the form of a heavy premium on exports of the means of production, especially of industrial and electrical equipment. Mandel could see that the goalposts could be changed, that the game could be changed. And of course, today, we are living in a world where even in heavy industrial machinery and so on, the tables have been turned by many, many countries. We are living Latin America, for example. Brazil is a leading exporter of aircraft. Who would have imagined this even a few decades ago? So this is, and you have the apparatus in Mandel to understand how this happens. I want to close, the final point I want to make is the following. When globalization discourse was very powerful, there were some people who could see through it. They said, what do you mean globalization? National economies still exist. States play a very central role in this, etc. And they came up, and here I'm thinking particularly of some social democratic writers like Ernest and Thompson and so on. They basically counterposed the globalization thesis by saying national economies remain important, and at best, what you are seeing is a trend towards what they call regionalization. EU, ASEAN, various other regional concentrations of productive power, with different countries getting together to create regional economies. This just makes me reflect that I wonder what Mandel would have said about that. Maybe he would have said, because if you read his book on the Second World War, he's very clear about this. He's very clear that there were two sorts of imperialisms in the Second World War that were going against one another. Well, throughout the First and Second World War. One was the regional imperialism of the German sort, where Germany tried to expand over contiguous territory. The other was the liberal imperialism, and put liberal in quotation marks, of the Americans and the English. They ruled over far-flung territories. In the end, perhaps what we will, because nation states are as important as they are, they remain so. What we may be witnessing is the slow triumph of the, although that the other imperialism was defeated, insofar as capitalism continues to exist, we may well be witnessing the slow triumph of the continental type of imperialism. Because what we are seeing is the triumph not of globalization, but a trend towards regionalization in the continent. A trend which is itself driven by tendencies towards increasing concentration of capital, which is itself driven by the tendency of the rich profit, that search for surplus profit.